In the heart of Imperial Rome, a wild story was told that would echo through history. The Empress of Rome herself laid down a challenge, not to a rival for power, but to the city's most famous prostitute. The contest? A 24-hour sexual marathon. The Empress, Valeria Messalina, didn't just compete. The story goes that she won. This is the unbelievable tale of how one woman's alleged desires and very real enemies created a scandal so great, the Roman Empire tried to erase her from history itself. But what if the most shocking part of the story isn't the scandal, but the fact that it might all be a lie? Before she became the most notorious woman in Rome, she was just a girl born into the world's most dangerous family, the Julio-Claudians. This was a dynasty so tangled with ambition and inbreeding that betrayal was practically a birthright. Messalina was a great-grandniece of the first emperor, Augustus, on both sides of her family, a pedigree that was both a privilege and a potential death sentence. In this world, your relatives were more likely to poison your dinner than offer you support. The air itself felt thick with paranoia, a leftover from the reigns of the suspicious Tiberius and the sadistic Caligula. Power wasn't just held, it was survived. Messalina learned early on that for a woman in the imperial court, value was measured in two ways: her bloodline and her marriage. Her marriage, however, was to a man the rest of the family treated like a joke. Around 38 AD, as a teenager, Messalina was married off to her much older cousin, Tiberius Claudius Drusus. He was nearly 50, 3 decades her senior, and seen as a bumbling, awkward scholar. Plagued by a limp, a tremor, and a stutter, Claudius was the punchline of his family's cruel jokes. For a young, beautiful, and ambitious woman like Messalina, this marriage must have felt like a dead end. She gave him 2 children, Claudia Octavia and a son, Britannicus, and in securing a male heir, she did her duty. But a secure place wasn't a powerful one. In 41 AD, the unthinkable happened. The tyrannical Emperor Caligula was assassinated by his own Praetorian Guard. A violent twist was about to throw her from the sidelines to the very center of that world. Chaos exploded. The Guard, fearing they'd be disbanded, scrambled to find a new emperor they could control. The air in the palace was thick with the scent of blood and the panic of a collapsing era. And who did they find cowering behind a curtain, terrified for his life? None other than the forgotten scholar, Claudius. The soldiers, seeing not a fool but a man they could manipulate, hoisted him onto their shoulders and declared him emperor. Suddenly, Messalina wasn't the wife of a laughingstock. She was the Empress of Rome. At barely 20 years old, she stood at the center of unimaginable power. But this power was fragile. Messalina understood the brutal reality. In the viper's nest, you either consolidated your power or you were consumed. She had no intention of being consumed. She would use every tool she had: her influence, her sharp instincts, and her own body. She would do what was necessary to not just survive, but to rule from the shadows. For most empresses, the palace was a gilded cage. The ideal was to be a model of chastity and quiet virtue. Messalina, however, allegedly saw the palace as a stage and a convenient alibi. As Claudius buried himself in the duties of the empire, a different story about Messalina began to spread. According to ancient writers, who were openly hostile to her, when night fell, the empress would slip out of the palace in disguise. Her destination was the Suburra, Rome's infamous district of brothels and crime. There, the story goes, the Empress of Rome would take up a room in a brothel and work through the night as a common prostitute. The poet Juvenal, writing decades later but drawing on the vicious gossip of the time, gives a vivid and damning account. He claims she worked under the name Lysiska, or she-wolf, a slang term for prostitutes. He wrote that she would stand in her doorway, nipples gilded, and service man after man, driven by a lust that was seemingly bottomless. When the brothel closed at dawn, he says she would be the last to leave, returning to the palace, tired, but not yet satisfied. The historian Cassius Dio, another enemy, took the story even further. He claimed Messalina didn't just visit brothels. She set one up inside the imperial palace itself, forcing high-ranking noblewomen to work for her. This detail, whether true or not, paints a picture of a woman taking pleasure not just in sex, but in the total humiliation of the Roman elite. But of all the stories, one stands out for its sheer audacity. It comes from Pliny the Elder, a contemporary historian. According to Pliny, Messalina challenged Rome's most famous prostitute, a woman named Scylla, to a competition, who could sleep with the most men in 24 hours. The venue was supposedly the palace itself. For a full day and night, the contest raged. Pliny records the final score with stunned disbelief. Sylla, the professional, eventually gave up. Messalina, however, continued, reaching a final count of 25 partners. The Empress had won. It's a story so scandalous, it's almost impossible to believe. And that's the crucial point. Is this history, or is it propaganda? These accounts were written by men from a senatorial class that was deeply hostile to powerful women. Was Messalina truly a sex-crazed empress who worked in brothels for fun? Or were these grotesque exaggerations designed to destroy her reputation, a form of political character assassination? By painting her as a monster of lust, her enemies could argue she wasn't a savvy political operator, but an unnatural woman who threatened the stability of Rome itself. The truth is likely far more complicated. While the lurid tales of Messalina's knights defined her legacy, they obscure a more dangerous truth. Her sexuality and her political ambition were often one and the same. She didn't just indulge her desires, she weaponized them. In the first years of Claudius's reign, Messalina moved quickly to secure her power. Her first targets were other women in the imperial family. Within a year, Claudius's niece, Julia Livilla, sister of the dead Emperor Caligula, was recalled from exile. She was popular and beautiful, and Messalina saw her as a rival. Messalina and her allies promptly fabricated charges of adultery against Julia. The accusation was enough. Claudius, easily swayed by his wife, had Julia exiled again, where she was starved to death. This became Messalina's signature move. In a society obsessed with female purity, an accusation of adultery was a political death sentence. Her cruelty wasn't just for women either. Any man who stood in her way, owned something she wanted, or rejected her advances found himself in mortal danger. According to Dio Cassius, Messalina desired her own stepfather, Appius Silanus. When he refused her, she and her key ally, the powerful freedman Narcissus, concocted a terrifyingly clever plot. They both told Claudius they'd had the exact same dream, that Silanus was going to murder him. When Silanus showed up at the palace later that day, the paranoid Claudius, terrified by the prophecy, had him executed without a trial. Perhaps her most infamous power play was against the wealthy senator Valerius Asiaticus. Asiaticus owned the spectacular gardens of Lucullus, a beautiful estate in Rome that Messalina coveted. In 46 AD, she had him arrested on trumped-up charges of treason. Asiaticus was forced to take his own life, and the magnificent gardens became the property of the Empress. Through these brutal maneuvers, Messalina established a reign of terror in the court. She forged alliances with Claudius's most influential freedmen, men like Narcissus and Pallas, who ran the empire's bureaucracy. For a time, they worked together, manipulating the emperor and enriching themselves. But this alliance was built on greed and fear, not loyalty. They watched with growing alarm. As Messalina's power grew more absolute and her behavior more reckless, they had helped create this force of nature, and they were beginning to fear she might one day turn on them. Messalina was at the height of her power, seemingly untouchable. But in her arrogance, she had forgotten the most important rule of Roman politics: overreach is always fatal. And she was about to make a mistake so brazen that it would leave even her allies with no choice but to destroy her. These stories of power, sex, and betrayal are the lifeblood of Roman history. If you're fascinated by the dark and dramatic side of the ancient world, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you don't miss our next dive into the cutthroat politics of the empire. By 48 AD, Messalina had grown restless. Her aging husband, Claudius, was no longer a figure of authority to her, but an obstacle. It was then that she began the most passionate and dangerous affair of her life with Gaius Silius, a handsome, ambitious consul-elect. The historian Tacitus, our main source for this, describes him as the most attractive man in Rome. Their affair was an open secret. Silius, blinded by passion, divorced his noble wife. Messalina, in turn, showered him with wealth and honors, even moving priceless heirlooms from the palace into Silius's home, a symbolic transfer of power that was lost on no one. But Silius pushed for more. He saw the aging Claudius as a weak link and proposed a plan that was nothing short of high treason. He and Messalina would marry. Then, they would depose Claudius, Silius would become emperor, and he would adopt Messalina's son, Britannicus, to secure the succession. Tacitus claims Messalina hesitated, knowing the colossal risk. But, he adds, she coveted the name of wife and was ultimately persuaded by the sheer audacity of the gamble. And so, they waited for the perfect opportunity, which came when Claudius traveled to the port of Ostia to oversee a sacrifice. The moment the emperor was gone, Messalina acted. In the heart of Rome, Messalina and Gaius Silius held a wedding. This wasn't a secret ceremony. It was a full public spectacle, complete with a signed marriage contract and a lavish banquet. Now, what was really going on here? Was this a genuine treasonous coup attempt, or was it something else? Some historians have suggested it may have been part of a Bacchic ritual, or a harvest festival, a piece of symbolic theater. But in the paranoid atmosphere of imperial Rome, the distinction was irrelevant. The perception was everything. The mother of the heir had publicly bound herself to another man, effectively divorcing the emperor in the most humiliating way imaginable. It was an act so brazen it defied belief, and for her enemies, it was the weapon they had been waiting for. In Ostia, Claudius remained blissfully ignorant. The news was so shocking that no one dared tell him. The task fell to the freedman Narcissus. He had been Messalina's ally, but he knew that if her coup with Silius succeeded, his own life was forfeit. He had to act. Knowing Claudius was indecisive and still infatuated with his wife, Narcissus enlisted two of the emperor's favorite courtesans. One of them, Calpurnia, threw herself at Claudius's feet and revealed that Messalina had married Silius. Claudius panicked. At that moment, Narcissus entered, stoking the emperor's paranoia and telling him that his wife's new husband would soon be master of Rome. The small group rushed back to the city. On the road, they were met by a desperate Messalina, with her children by her side. She tried to intercept Claudius, hoping to plead her case, but Narcissus, standing by the emperor's side, relentlessly shouted a list of her crimes, drowning out her pleas and ensuring she couldn't get near her husband. Claudius was taken directly to Silius's house, where Narcissus had prepared the final damning evidence, the priceless heirlooms of his own ancestors, given to Messalina's lover. The conspirators were rounded up. Silius himself asked for a quick death and was executed on the spot. Meanwhile, Messalina had fled to the gardens of Lucullus, the very property she had acquired through murder. Her estranged mother, Domitia Lepida, found her there and offered cold comfort, telling her that her life was over and the only thing left was to die with some honor. Back at the palace, Claudius's resolve was already failing. Softened by wine, his anger faded. He started calling Messalina the poor woman and asked that she be brought to him in the morning. Narcissus heard this and knew he had to act. If Messalina saw Claudius, she would likely be spared, and his own death would be certain. Pretending to act on the emperor's authority, he gave a direct order to the praetorian officers on duty. Go to the gardens and execute Messalina immediately. The soldiers found Messalina on the floor. They offered her a sword to take her own life, but her courage failed her. She wept and trembled. Finally, one of the tribunes ran her through with his sword. The news was brought to Claudius at dinner. Tacitus records that the emperor showed no emotion. He simply called for another goblet of wine and continued his meal. Soon after, the Senate passed a damnatio memoriae, a condemnation of memory. They ordered her name chiseled from all public monuments and her statues torn down, an official attempt to erase every trace of her existence. In the end, Messalina was executed not for her legendary promiscuity, but for a political miscalculation of epic proportions. Her story became a cautionary tale, her name a synonym for depravity. But Messalina's history was written by her enemies, men like Tacitus and Suetonius, who served a new dynasty and saw powerful women as signs of a corrupt state. They used her as a symbol of everything they believed was wrong with an empire where power was wielded in the decadent, private world of the palace. This leaves us with the unsettling question of her legacy. Was Valeria Messalina truly the insatiable monster described by the ancient sources? Or was she a ruthless political operator, a woman in a man's world who used the only weapons she had, seduction, fear, and intrigue to seize power? Was her notorious reputation the truth of her life? Or was it the ultimate act of character assassination, a smear campaign written by the men who destroyed her? The Roman Empire succeeded in erasing her statues, but it failed to erase her story. It survives as a testament to the brutal, cutthroat world of the Imperial Court and the unforgettable Empress who dared to challenge its rules.